Welcome everyone to another seminar on book launches and book launches of humor, which is a seminar that focuses on we select different books and it's a more of a critical discussion of the book. And today we are very glad to have among us Minna Salami, and we are going to discuss her book in Sensuous Knowledge. A black feminist approach for everyone. So Minna Salami is a Finnish Nigerian journalist who has propagated information on African feminist issues, the African diaspora, and Nigerian women through her award-winning blog, Miss Afro-Patriarchal, which she created and has been editing since 2010. The issues covered in the blog are ranging from polygamy to feminism to relationships. Apart from blogging, she also writes on social issues. She is represented on the Global Educator Network of Duke University, the African Network, and the Guardian Book Network of The Guardian. Salami's blogs and articles are featured in The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and HuffPost. She is in the recipient of several national awards. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Minna Salami to give us a 20-minute discussion about her book, and then we will have a question and answer session. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Minna.
Wonderful. Hi, Azza, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm going to speak about the key themes in the book. But before I do, I thought I'd share some context on the kind of deep motivation to write it. So as I mentioned, I've been writing a blog called Ms. Afropolitan. And I've been writing this blog for over a decade. And when I started writing it, I was driven by a need to shout out to the world that women like me, so basically women who are African and women who are feminist, that we exist. Because at the time there was a real sort of lack of visibility. I mean, there still is, but the most feminist blogs were typically led by white women, and most Pan-African blogs at the time were written by men. And this was an age in which blogs were really emerging as sort of key spaces for civic discussion. So I was driven by this need to really claim space. To the extent that African feminism was spoken about at the time, and still today to a notable extent, the topics were usually connected to the front lines of global humanitarian issues. So whenever I would mention the work that I do, people would tell me about issues like HIV prevention or war or maternal health and famine and things like that. And it made me want to scream out loud that, just as Western feminism is not only about teen pregnancies or domestic violence, African feminism is not strictly about humanitarian causes. So African feminists are also concerned with existential questions and social criticisms. And of course, I and all African feminists, and probably all feminists at large, are very deeply concerned with the kind of humanitarian causes that affect women disproportionately. But this inability to to perceive African women as intellectual agents in the world, as people who shape the global discourse and knowledge production in itself, is something that I saw as very much connected actually to the other disenfranchised situations that so many of us find ourselves in. Because if we are not allowed the space to express ourselves about our most sort of intimate as well as our intellectual work, then it kind of means that we are not allowed to express ourselves across and shape all other actions that follow from that kind of knowledge production. And so that's the kind of source that that I came from, the background that I came from, and my ontology, if you like, that motivated me to write Sensuous Knowledge. And so I thought I would start with reading a few lines by Wangari Maathai, the ecofeminist and Nobel laureate. She said, "Today we are faced with a challenge that calls for a shift in our thinking, so that humanity stops threatening its life support system. We are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process, heal our own wounds. Indeed, to embrace the whole of creation in all of its diversity, beauty, and wonder." And I wanted to start with those lines because they speak so well to the kind of epistemic traditions that are so overconfident and certain in the way that we approach social crises. So whether it's climate change or social inequalities, surveillance capitalism, all kinds of divisions and crises that we face today, we approach them with this overconfident epistemic certainty. And I'm arguing instead, as Wangari Maathai's quote speaks to, for a kind of a curiosity and openness toward how we tackle crises. And working as a social critic, a writer, and a speaker over the past decade, I've been in the spaces that I occupy. There's one word that particularly always comes up, and that word is system. So whenever we, activists or scholars or artists or intellectuals, when we think about how we can educate and transform all of these social crises, very typically we will go back and say that the root cause of them is the system. And we will say that the system is, it's a corrupt system, it's a violent system, it's an oppressive system, things like that. But what do we actually mean by the word system? Because if we're saying that the system is so flawed and it can be blamed for all of the kind of social ills, what is it that we actually mean? And of course, what people typically are referring to when they say system is the institutions. So like the legal system, the educational system, the political system, and all of the power structures and hierarchies that inform those systems. So patriarchy and white supremacy and classism and those kinds of structures. But I wanted to think about the system a little bit differently and more deeply. And so for me, the system with, the capital S system is knowledge itself. So our intellect, the ways that we think and why we think in those ways, etc. And the failure to perceive the system in this way as our intellect, that's what we know, and the kind of epistemic traditions that we're coming from, means that whenever we have the opportunity to transform our institutions, we instead end up replicating and even increasing the same kind of social problem. So if we think, for instance, this is particularly pertinent with technology. If we think about how much promise the internet held for the feminist movement, for Pan-Africanism, and for all kinds of global transformation movements, the internet, social media, all once held a lot of promise, but instead, as we all too painfully and clearly can see, they've instead ended up augmenting and replicating the same kinds of patterns of division and destruction. And now we are, of course, standing at a threshold of technological shifts that are going to have large-scale ramifications on our societies, and particularly, as a matter of concern for me, these shifts are going to have implications on African societies, where due to geopolitical history and exploitation, neocolonialism, and so on, we find ourselves in a position where we are already disenfranchised. And so with artificial intelligence, technologies like what is it called? I wrote it down. IVG, which stands for in vitro gametogenesis, where you can grow a fetus outside of a woman's womb. All these kinds of technologies, and of course the colonization of space, these are conversations and technologies that are going to have such huge implications on our continent, and yet we are not shaping those spaces. So I'm prefacing to say that these are the kinds of issues that led me to write Sensuous Knowledge, which is a book that proposes another way of knowing. And so in the book, I coined the notion Euro-patriarchal knowledge, by which I mean a male-dominant and Eurocentric way of thinking about ourselves and the cosmos. And this way of knowledge is what has become the system. So it is conventional and systemic in the way that it defines our power relations and the resources and the time constructs of this planet. I call it Euro-patriarchal knowledge because it has been shaped by a small group of people who are typically male, typically of European heritage, and typically belonging to elite classes. And this includes men of, both kind of illuminating thought and destructive thought. So you have everyone from, people like Marx and Hobbes and Nietzsche and Kant and Foucault, Derrida, you name it, who have all sort of shaped this sphere that I'm calling Euro-patriarchal knowledge. And I mention these names because, as you may be thinking, they are not all coming from the same ilk, and Euro-patriarchal knowledge is, in a sense, sometimes it has contributed with wisdom to the world. So whereas Euro-patriarchal structures are always destructive because they are institutionalized hierarchies of where different groups of people are positioned as superior, inferior, and so on, and thereafter exploited. Euro-patriarchal knowledge in itself, which is this kind of meta-narrative that informs the structures, is not, I argue in the book, necessarily always negative. So even the very problematic Enlightenment movement, it nevertheless, the epistemic tradition of it has contributed with things like modern universities and encyclopedias, maps, trains, planes. So things that potentially enhance our collective experience. But what I'm critiquing at depth is what lies at the heart of Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which is a kind of obsession with assessment and quantification, measurement, rationality and reason. So you could say that Euro-patriarchal knowledge is an approach to knowledge that values science, but it undervalues the physical world. It undervalues inclusivity and earth and pluralism and embodiment. And it sees all of these things, it kind of classifies in its taxonomies and classifications. It groups all of these things together as endless resources to exploit. So the same way that the more than human natural world is exploited is the way that the women's bodies are exploited and the ways that indigenous communities are exploited. So in bringing us back to the kind of thresholds of technological shifts that we are standing on the brink on, and of course, aside from technological shifts, also political transformations, global pandemics, all of the kind of big questions of our times. The argument of the book is that we need a new way of knowing, we need a different way of knowing. And that way of knowing is needs to be connected to regeneration and exploration and to our bodies and our feelings, as well as to science and reason and things like that. Because at the moment, our knowledge system can help us to create evolved cities, for example, but not evolved citizens of those cities. So there's always this discord and dissonance when Euro-patriarchal knowledge is shaping the structures. And so I call this other way of knowing sensuous knowledge, which is the title of the book. And I conceived of sensuous knowledge when I was at the Singularity University at the NASA research camp in Silicon Valley. This was about 5 years ago now. And I was there to give a lecture on African feminism. And it was a trip that was both incredibly uplifting and incredibly concerning for me. So it was uplifting because I was there for a week and I was in the company of people who geek out about ideas that can, big ideas that can shape the world. And that's something that I also do. And so it was a very sort of stimulating place for me to be. It was concerning because it really brought home to me how the kind of blind spots and biases in what I later came to call Euro-patriarchal knowledge cannot actually manifest those kinds of big ideas that people there were advocating and excited about. And of course, this was hardly the first time that I found myself, in that kind of environment. As a woman and a person of African heritage, this is, and working in the ideas world, it's a kind of regular fodder. But I guess maybe something about this being in Silicon Valley. So, this was people who are really going to shape all of our collective futures. It wasn't just a kind of talk shop. It was felt very real. And so it just was disconcerting. And to give you an example, there was one of the incidents that really was disconcerting was I recall having dinner with a group of people who were all men, they were all white, and they were all very privileged. And during the dinner conversation, it transpired that they were absolutely convinced that they were going to live well into their hundreds. So until they were 150 or maybe even up to 200. And they were taking out insurance policy based on this kind of true, sincere belief. And coming from a part of the world in which, in so many parts of Africa, life expectancy is well below the hundreds due to the history of politics and oppression. It was just so jarring to me, that the same people who pretend to be about social change could not even really see these discrepancies in their mode of thought. And so I that was where this concept, sensuous knowledge, appeared at the front of my mind. And I instantly knew that that was going to be the title of the book that I already was thinking I wanted to write. And I was, the sensibility that I wanted the book to have was a humanistic one, but also what I've called an Afro-politan, or my blog is called Ms. Afro-politan, so a kind of cosmopolitan worldview, but with Africa at the center. And of course, it was also informed by Black African heritage feminisms, which is why the subtitle is A Black Feminist Approach for Everyone. And so I wrote the book with the key insight that you cannot use patriarchal logic to create feminist transformation. And in Sensuous Knowledge, I instead, what I do is I develop the idea, the theory that is sensuous knowledge, and then I apply it to universal concepts, philosophical concepts, power, identity, beauty, womanhood, things like that. But rather than the typical Euro-patriarchal view, I instead look at these concepts through the lens of Black feminism with an Africa-centered approach. And I guess one of the key things to say is that the Euro-patriarchal logic, as I've explained it, it is obsessed with taxonomies and assessment and quantification, and it is always seeking to separate and divide. And so instead, what I wanted to do was to unite and interweave different realms of lived experience, as well as different fields of knowledge. So storytelling with academic study, arts with science, and so on. And the book starts off with, it starts off in Yoruba land, so in modern day Nigeria. And it's also in many ways, it is a Yoruba book. So I am of Yoruba heritage and I do not speak the language, but I have, growing up in Nigeria, it's the kind of worldview and paradigm that has shaped so much of my thought. And so in Yoruba, there's a concept called ogbon. And I'm just going to make sure that I still have enough time. Do let me know if I need to stop. In Yoruba, there's a concept called ogbon, which means knowledge, but it's more literally means phronesis, which is the ancient Greek term for practical wisdom. And the creation myth goes that when the gods gave people ogbon, they split it into two. They split it into what they called ogbon inu and ogbon ori, which means knowledge of the gut and knowledge of the head, or you could say emotional intelligence and reason. And the gods gave the people these two because they knew that to only have one type of ogbon was to be only partly wise. So sensuous knowledge is rooted in this worldview. It is rooted in, rather than separating these realms, bringing them together instead. I also just want to add that I don't mean, when I say sensuous knowledge, I don't mean sensual. So while the two words are related, sensual is tied to the senses, of course, to the kind of olfactory, auditory, tactility, and bodily pleasures, whereas sensuousness includes the senses but transcends them. So it's something is sensuous when it affects you entirely, mind, body, and soul. The word sensuous was coined by John Milton to describe poetry. And he coined it because he wanted to move away from the word sensual to describe something that affects us in that kind of integrated way as poetry does. And so my book is arguing for an approach to knowledge that affects us in that kind of holistic way, which is not to say that I am rejecting sensuality. In fact, in the book, I argue for a kind of eroticization of knowledge. So the erotic coming from eros in ancient Greek, which of course means love. So a more love-filled approach to knowledge production. So I was going to end with a kind of a small thought experiment on how sensuous knowledge can work in praxis, but maybe I should stop here, or should I go ahead? Azza, maybe you can let me know.
No, please continue. I mean, it's your closing words, so please.
Okay, thank you. So the way that I think can be useful to describe how we can approach sensuous knowledge on a daily basis is to think of just something as mundane as what you had for breakfast this morning. So let's say you had a slice of bread, like I did. If you were to describe your breakfast with Euro-patriarchal knowledge, you might describe the exact nutritional content, so exactly how many grams of carbs or how many calories was there in the slice of bread. If you were to describe your breakfast with sensuous knowledge instead, you would describe the nutritional content, but you would also describe maybe the texture of the bread. What does it feel like? What was it like to chew it? What color did it have? What kind of sounds did you hear when you were eating your breakfast? Did you hear cars passing by or people talking in the distance? Maybe you heard birds singing. And how did it make you feel? How did you feel as you were eating your breakfast? And who made your bread? What is the production line, or which tradition of baking does the bread come from? And of course, I'm hardly suggesting that being able to describe our breakfast in a lyrical way is going to change the world. The point is that if we can apply this more holistic way of thinking to something as quotidian as what we have for breakfast, then we can begin to think about how that could apply to bigger issues, and most significantly to our social movements and the ways that we approach transformation. So ultimately, that kind of transformation can really impact people's actual lives and not be rooted in the Euro-patriarchal knowledge way of thinking that feels so detached and ultimately just creates further distancing from the real heart of the matter. So to end, I would say that sensuous knowledge is a pragmatic utopian vision. So it's utopian, but I share this example of the slice of bread to show that even while it is utopian, it's kind of doable at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Minna, for the very, very interesting talk. I personally have a lot of questions, but let me go to the chat. And I think there's a very interesting question from our director, Divine Fu. He's thanking you for the provocative ideas, and we would like to have a further clarification of the difference between Euro-patriarchal logic and Afro-patriarchal logic.
Thank you very much, Divine. That's a great question. What is the difference between the two? I think what has I'll reply by sharing how it has been really interesting to me that after writing the book, a lot of African men have, I've seen a lot of African men use the term Euro-patriarchal, as sort of maybe distancing themselves from kind of patriarchal affinities. And certainly that is not the aim, as I say in the book. I do think that there is something, there certainly is something that we could call Afro-patriarchal knowledge. But it is not the thing that defines this big system that governs our world. So that's one key difference, is that, Afro-patriarchal logic does not have the same global power that Euro-patriarchal logic has. I would say that Afro-patriarchal logic is also very much responding to Euro-patriarchal logic. It's, in some sense, it can be augmented because it is, it has the need to assert itself vis-a-vis a knowledge system that centers white men. And so it has a lot of, there's a huge danger, of course, in Afro-patriarchal logic, because it is, it oppresses women and the non-human natural world. It kind of disdains and diminishes us in order to also prove itself to the Euro-patriarchal system of knowledge.
I think, yes, I will continue with Divine's second question, then I will come to Vanessa, because it seems like it's a continuous to what he asked at the beginning. So he said, if Euro-patriarchal logic is dangerous for our transformation, is it therefore possible that Afropolitanism and those of us coded as Afropolitan, partly shaped by this logic, dangerous for the continent? Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Oh, what a good question. So the way that I see it, I think when I pointed to during my talk that Euro-patriarchal knowledge, insofar as the kind of narrative goes rather than the structures, that they're not always negative. There have historically been white men of European heritage, and men generally, and people of European heritage generally, who have contributed to our global pool of knowledge with ideas and structures even, and movements that I think are aligned with sensuous knowledge. Cosmopolitanism is one of those that I think has a really huge kind of hugely beautiful message to it, in terms of how it means to, in its original sense, rather than the kind of modern cosmopolitan who travels and jet sets around the world, but the philosophical cosmopolitanism, which is about kind of learning to coexist with others and seeing yourself as a citizen of the cosmos rather than just small pockets of space, is a major contribution to the human pool of knowledge. Another thing that comes to mind that I think is really, your question is kind of set to be challenging to me, which I very much appreciate. But to my rebuttal would be that it's very interesting how the notion Afropolitanism was coined by an African woman, Taya Selassie. And I've been quite interested that since the kind of major criticisms of it came into the public sphere, there's been a shift toward people embracing Afrofuturism rather than Afropolitanism. And that's, I have some concerns with Afrofuturism as its position as this kind of, it's very much to do with aesthetics and not so much with kind of in-depth knowledge production. But nevertheless, Afrofuturism was coined by a white man. whereas Afropolitanism was coined by an African woman. And so it's you know, it's so fascinating to me how, and telling how, you know, our preferences go, and how, you know, the kind of, actually the Euro-patriarchal logic system makes us the propensity to dismiss the work of African women and to almost to ridicule it is something that happens so easily. Whereas, you know, concepts that are coined by art critics in the New Yorker, as Afrofuturism was, get this kind of credency. So yeah, but it's obviously, it's a very complex and layered school of thought that you're alluding to. You say you're not a fan of Afrofuturism. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like rather than my stance with these things is to, rather than be anti, to kind of find the affinities, because we live in a world where there's so many, you know, real enemies like surveillance capitalism, extractive capitalism, land grabbing, hyper right-wing ideologies that, you know, for me, I wouldn't say that I don't like Afrofuturism. I want to unpack it, and I want people to unpack Afropolitanism. But, you know, my God, if I have to choose which kind of ideas to align myself with, I'll take Afrofuturism any day. So yeah. But thank you. Thanks.
Azar, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Divine, for the interesting questions. And I think, let me take Chikazi because he raised his hand, and then we could go back to the chat because I want to link my question to Vanessa's question here. So yeah, so please, please, Chikazi.
Chikazi muted.
Okay, hi. I was not able to unmute earlier. Sorry. Hi, Minna. My name is Chikeze. I'm Nigerian. So you're my Nigerian sister. Hello. And I am with Huma as a postdoctoral researcher. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here. I liked your optimism at the end of your presentation, where you said that the idea of mainstreaming sensuous knowledge as an approach is doable. Yes, and I quite agree. But I wanted to hear more about how the specific ways in which you recommend or feel that this approach could be mainstreamed as in a world that is still dominated by Euro-patriarchal approach. You know, the specific everyday practical ways that this can be achieved, yeah, by intellectuals or by other stakeholders. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chikezi. Nice to meet you. So I guess the first thing to say is that unfortunately, I don't think, and I don't want this approach to be mainstreamed. Or like that, or put it this way, that was not my intention with writing it. And the reason for that is because what I'm actually proposing is something that is, you know, kind of anti-quantification. It's a theory that is criticizing the ways in which we create bureaucracies and like endless kind of mechanization of knowledge. And so it would be kind of counter to what I'm proposing to create any kinds of like rigid plan for how it can be effectualized. But I don't think that that's fully what you're saying either, because of course there's still ways that we can think about this. But what I'm calling for is more of it's a sensibility. So that's the first thing to say, that you know, one thing that we can do is to engage more widely, to read more, to bring in our feelings more, not our like personal feelings or traumas or likes or whatever. I mean, absolutely, there are times and places where that is relevant. But in terms of like, how do we, for example, if we were discussing the South African patriarchal state, let's say, we would, using Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which we typically do, the emphasis might be on like the statistics, the history, you know, the dates of so and such, the political announcements or whatever. And all of those things, of course, count tremendously and matter. But if we also applied sensuous knowledge, you know, we might think about what does it feel like to be a woman, to be a man in living under a patriarchal state, in this instance in South Africa. So bringing in multiple angles to the way that we approach transformation. Yeah, it's I guess in terms of the practicality of it, like if starting on an individual level and then in collectives, in movements, and even more broadly in states or organizations of various sorts, it's quite simply a holistic approach. So really always thinking about not only the one-dimensional approach to something, but what can the arts tell us about the issue that we are grappling with? What can our bodies tell us? What can nature tell us? As well as, you know, bringing in our quantifying research methods or whatever it might be.
Yes, yeah, I get it. And then that means, in other words, bringing in this subjectivity and nuanced approach to things. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Subjectivity that is, you know, informed. So a kind of inner empiricism that is obviously very much in conversation with the kind of outer, external empirical world.
Yeah. I'm also thinking in terms of how we can adopt these strategies, because I've recently been thinking about how spaces like academia can be less masochist, you know, and less patriarchal and masculinist, you know. So yeah, I think this idea of sensuous knowledge, you know, it kind of captures that kind of radical but very, very essential thinking. Yeah.
Thanks you. Yeah, and one thing that comes to mind as you say that is that, you know, this isn't something new, which is why, you know, it's rooted in Black feminist traditions. Of course, I'm bringing my own unique experiences and views on these things, but you know, it is what Black feminists, indigenous groups have, and as I mentioned, I use the Yoruba worldview, but we have similar metaphysics and epistemologies all across the continent that have been advocating for something like this. And you know, you speak of the academic space, and I think, yeah, like the ways in which it's always the very rigid, formulaic ways that are seen as the accepted form of knowledge, and just bringing in more of that creative spirit and a kind of subjectivity as well is definitely what I'm talking about.
Thank you very much, Chikezi. So we go to Vanessa in the chat. So she's asking, can we think about the use of sensuous here to mean both sense, as one would speak about common sense, thus making some reference to logic and reason, and sense as in a bodily experience?
Yeah, 100%. That's, I mean, that is what I'm arguing. So, for instance, if you think of books, you know, books are they are objects that we can touch, we can smell them, we can taste them on our tongues if we read them out loud. So they very much involve our senses. They also have like different textures. So some books are hardback, some are hand stitched. You have aged books. but then they also can transform us potentially in, you know, life-changing ways. They can be therapeutic, they can be healing. So books are a perfect example of the word, what I mean with sensuous, you know, something that can absolutely be something that absolutely affects our senses, but also far beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this brings me to I mean, the chapter that you wrote on Blackness, and I thought how interesting to look at it in this in the African context. I mean, what Blackness means. African doesn't necessarily mean, or African and Blackness are not synonymous. They are somehow intertwining. They speak to each other, but they're not synonymous. And the way a lot of Africans understand Blackness is really different than what is built in the Euro-patriarchal idea of Africanness or Blackness, you know. And it came to my mind, there was an article, I forgot the writer, Sudanese writer who wrote about how Sudanese think about Blackness in this kind of spectrum, you know, I mean, and it's not just the color, you know, it's not just colorism, but it's also as like if we involve our senses, you know, to understand the bodily experience, what, as Vanessa said, the bodily experience of being Black, you know, like it's different shades of Black, different colors, you know, you have the yellow, you have the red, you have also, like, we also use the concept, the word green, you know, to refer to the Blackness, and we use the word purple, you know, also to refer to such kind of Blackness. And then it also somehow it layers with texture, you know, with senses of the feeling, you know, for example, the hair, how the hair is very essential in somehow differentiating and categorizing. And also the audio, you know, like I was once like, it was a very interesting experience to me to hear like people who are saying that, yeah, Black people smell different, you know. So engaging this kind of sensual experience of the body, I found it very interesting. I mean, I think you talked about your own color complexion, you know, in a particular context, how is it perceived, you know, and it would be interesting to reflect on that what you said, because I really find it very interesting. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, thank you. So interesting about the different approaches, different language that exists around the continent to think about Blackness, which was something that I was very much interested in exploring in that chapter in particular. Yeah, so my argument when it comes to Blackness in the book is that that we think about Blackness in our times predominantly as a political identity, and one which is in resistance to whiteness. So Blackness is something that you know, inherently connotes protest, and I'm taking issue with that to say that if that is what Blackness most above everything is, then we will not be able to escape feelings of inferiority and shame and anger that are so toxic to the human spirit and to progress. And I'm not proposing to change the language of Blackness in order to resist that narrative. I'm seeking something that is actually a truth rather than the truth, but a truth about Blackness that has been hidden. And what that is that Blackness is a kind of a conduit of knowledge for people of African heritage that are socialized as Black. And that it is a conduit that is not just relevant in our times, but that it has always been a vehicle for how we define ourselves. And so, you know, I approached that chapter maybe more than any of the other chapters almost as an archaeologist, so kind of seeking a truth about Blackness and having to like excavate all of these lies and myths and political statements that surround Blackness. And in that process, you know, that was what I found, that like going very far back, there's the use of the word Black in its different variations. And of course, not always, or hardly ever, you know, if we go back to Kemet, to ancient Egypt, or to Nubia, or place Nok in Western Africa, places like that, like they were not responding to race as we know it today, which is a recently modern invention. But Blackness basically is this, is a kind of repository from where we can glean and engage in conversations that are intergenerational, diasporic, and contemporary about existential questions, and not just about protest and resistance and you know, how do we transcend racism, but also existential questions about what does friendship mean to Black people, or how do we relate to things like death or love or the arts or knowledge in itself. So yeah, so that was really the key aim, was to show this vastness and to decenter whiteness, because I'm so frustrated with how, especially like in some sense after the Black Lives Matter protests last year and the recent years of decolonization, so much has changed for the better. You know, there's definitely a heightened awareness of racial oppression. But maybe, you know, in tandem with that, there's also this hyper emphasis on Blackness being a category of resistance. And that feels very wrong to me. You know, there's so much more, we are so much more than that due to our Blackness. There's a history, there's all these stories, there's all this knowledge, there's all, as you so well put it, as a like the way that we are in our bodies. And it's not to essentialize, but there are patterns that, you know, that even can be embodied about Blackness. So it's, yeah, that's the aim.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is another question. Let me see a lot of things happening in the chat, but let me read the question of, I think it's Vanessa again. So she said, also, if I may, is that to suggest that the holistic way of thinking is a post-patriarchal logic or a matriarchal logic? Or matriarchal, yeah. Yeah. If like this like if we want to go and beyond the Eurocentric, is it a matriarchal logic? You know, that's what this is how I understand it. I don't, maybe Vanessa is here, so she can probably phrase the question, but this is how I understood.
I understand now.
Okay.
Sorry. I was looking for the question in the chat, and I think. Yeah, so I love that question. So I'm not advocating for matriarchy, because that would be, you know, the mirror image of another system of dominance. But that said, I think it definitely is aligned with what I'm about to say, which is that if we think about patriarchy today, we forget that what patriarchy really means is rule of elder men. So it's the rule of grandfathers, you could say. And if we were to flip that, and just as a thought experiment, to think about what a rule of grandmothers would look like, which is what a matriarchy would be a rule of elder woman. The elder, the notion of the elder is usually forgotten in these conversations. Then yes, in some sense, sensuous knowledge is informed by a kind of elderly feminine energy of sorts, whatever that might be. I mean, the word feminine is a bit of a tricky one, because can be essentialistic. But basically, if we think about the kind of archetype of grandfathers, grandfathers can be very thoughtful, but they also, even in their best imagery, the best representations of grandfathers, if we listen to like, folklore and stories across the African continent and beyond, grandfathers are, they're quite distant. Like they appear, they give the children a story or some nice toy or whatever, and then they do their own thing. Grandmothers, if we think of that kind of archetype, they're very present, and they are, they're actually not just sort of loving and maternal, they're also very direct. The grandmother is the person who comes and tells you as it really is. And so, yeah, that kind of spirit is something that is, when we think of patriarchy and matriarchy that way, I think it's helpful because it shows us how much the grandmotherly spirit is missing from our social constructs. It's missing from knowledge. It's missing from power. In fact, it's very literally missing in that older women are made to seem invisible. They kind of disappear from the public space. So yeah, I am very much, I don't go into that in the book. I wouldn't describe it as such, but I would love to have more of the grandmother's presence in knowledge production.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Mimi. Mimi, do you want to unmute yourself since you're here? This session was supposed to be you or you're chairing, but yeah, we would like to have you, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Azza. Thank you, Minna. Apologies for the late arrival. My question goes towards thinking about Euro-patriarchy and other terms such as terms that are used in social science like Western-centric or Western medicine or Western this, Western that, Western education, etc. And of course, I understand that the idea of this particular category or logic speaks to or points to what is believed to be a particular philosophy of thought which is relevant, more relevant than others. But I kind of ask myself, when we look deeper into approaches such as medicine or the characteristics of quantifying things, some of these ideas are taken from spaces that are otherwise not Eurocentric or Western. They are borrowed from other regions. I gave an example in the chat that mathematics, for example, some of the ideas, fundamental ideas were borrowed from Mesopotamia and Egypt. Some of the ways of dealing with illnesses today, the biomedicine today, some of those treatments are borrowed from herbal approaches that are otherwise not Eurocentric. Could there be a space where within that category of Eurocentrism, there is an acknowledgement that this logic does, I don't know, how do we acknowledge that it's not necessarily Eurocentric, but takes from other areas? Is that important, or I don't know, it's something I've been grappling with for the past few weeks, especially when thinking about Western technology and I don't know. I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm referring to with Euro-patriarchal knowledge is it's quite specifically the quantification obsession, or including other methodologies to do with assessment and the kind of robotization. I use the word robotic a lot in the book to describe it. And so it is not mathematics in itself by any means, like as mathematics was invented by Indians, I believe, there was to my very limited understanding, but mathematics initially had like a more poetic quality to it. So it actually, you could say that our ancestors who invented things like herbalisms and mathematics actually had a kind of sensuous knowledge, because quite often, they lived in societies in which they had to have that. This kind of knowledge production was so connected to their immediate lived experience. So Euro-patriarchal knowledge is actually the kind of approach that uses these things, uses this knowledge that has been invented by others. So it's not a question of necessarily of like invention, who came up with mathematics, or who came up with, that's why like I address topics like, let's say, beauty or identity. These are not topics that were invented by European men. It's that their particular approach to, like with beauty, there's all these, the golden ratio and the line of beauty and all these kinds of systemic, methodological and robotic approaches, which have as an aim to continuously perpetuate a system of domination in which we rank and create hierarchies. So it's not that they invented those things, it's how they are utilized. And so I certainly think that there's a lot of space to still bring in within sensuous knowledge and that mode of thought, to value, like I love mathematics. I'm not very good at it, but I love it as a, it's a poetic language. And science is, of course, the best language we have for deductive inquiry. I'm by no means opposing that, nor saying that other parts of the global human society haven't been key to shaping that. It's more that Euro-patriarchal knowledge is so dominant. And also adding to what you said, that there are, of course, other, like saying Western thought or white supremacy, are other ways that we have critiqued this system many times. Indigenous people and Black feminists have been critiquing these systems for a long time. But Hooks calls it a white supremacist, patriarchal, militarist approach. But I guess Euro-patriarchal just felt nifty at the end of the day, because it combines two of the key traits of this approach, which is that it is Eurocentric and that it is patriarchal. And you could probably put those on a scale. Like sometimes it is maybe more patriarchal. So the entire, the last, only 0.5% of the last 3,500 years of recorded history is women's history, only 0.5%. So even when we are looking at regions, in the African continent or Mesopotamia, we are still looking at patriarchal thought that has dominated those regions as well, for the most part. So yeah, hope that helps.
Thank you very much. We passed 5 o'clock, but there's still a couple of questions in the chat. So if you like to answer them, or it will be, yeah. So I don't want.
I'm happy to answer them. I can stay on for another 5 minutes or so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question is from Vanessa. Can we take then to indicate something about nuance, as she's she's very interesting in the point of nuance. Nuance as insufficient. In other words, do we keep overstepping it, perhaps because it creates an uneasiness in a world where we want certainty? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Completely. We want certainty. We want to. We want this not because it's human nature, but because we're all kind of inculcated in this conventional education, where we have been indoctrinated to think that we have to know. We've become incapable of just existing with unknowns, with uncertainty. And yet, that is not knowing is such a revitalizing quality that we need not only in our personal lives, but also collectively and in our societies, because that is the kernel for curiosity. You know, when we don't know something, we can become curious about it. And in that journey, we can find some kind of awe toward what we are learning. And ultimately a kind of, that encourages intimacy in some sense. So if I come across a tree, you know, and I'm struck by it, if I know everything about it, I know its Latin name, and I know exactly what kind of fungi lives in its roots, and et cetera, that kind of takes away from, it can add to my curiosity, but it can also take away something that if I don't know, if I'm unsure, you know, I start to explore for myself. And in that process, I create a kind of intimacy, a sensuousness with that very tree. And so the combination of the two is essential, but we are so much in the world of where we have to classify everything. And of course, ultimately what that is a kind of escapism. You know, there's a real fear to discover and to be with ourselves as we are, with, you know, as humans. We see this, again, technologies, you know, whether it's medical technology or social technology, it's such a strong example, you know, like we, rather than utilize our technologies to create that kind of inner empiricism that can reflect so that we become more evolved citizens. And by evolved, I mean that we can exist in some kind of relative conscientiousness without destroying each other, without creating so much suffering. If we can, you know, we keep on instead using technology to escape that. There's such a strong element of escapism. So yes, absolutely, nuance is, you know, it's an unfashionable thing, but it's very important for human progress.
Okay, I will take the last questions from Divine, and then we could conclude. So the question of becoming unscientific or academic subjectivities is something I am particularly interested in, and I wonder if you could reflect on a question you recently reflected on. How has your own lived experience impacted your writing?
My lived experience has, you know, of course, you know, it's entirely impacted my writing. I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is that I always had this feeling of not belonging. I think many of us, you know, even somebody who's lived in, you know, one place in the Western world, let's say a very privileged life, I think increasingly in such a world of information, like even such a person might feel a lack of a sense of belonging. For me, it was really pronounced being somebody who is of mixed racial heritage, mixed ethnicities, there were many languages in my household, many religions. My father's Muslim, my mother was Protestant. Grew up in Lagos, then moved to Sweden. There was always, and of course, many of these things gave me, you know, vast privileges in life. So I don't say that as, you know, to kind of only negatives. But one thing that it always meant was that I never felt like I belonged. And the first place that I can never really say that I felt a kind of home was in Black feminism. So when I discovered Black feminism and I read Black feminist books, and I thought, wow, this is, you know, a kind of reflection of myself. This is a space in which I can ask questions that feel relevant to my lived experience. And so that is, you know, always the primary thing that is reflected in my writing. And I guess I don't know how helpful that is for others, but maybe, you know, the question of where is it that one feels a sense of home, whether it's an ideological home or philosophical or physical, you know, but to think on that and how that then impacts our research and our writing, maybe it's useful.
Okay, yeah. Yes, we sadly came to the end of the session. I mean, we would love to, like, I mean, it's obviously a discussion that will never stop, and definitely we will have you again, you know, to have more discussions about the book, and I mean, and about other books we are anticipating that you will write, you know, and so yeah, thank you very much, Minna, for being with us, and thank you everyone for your patience, and yeah, and yes, it's the end of our session for today.
Thank you very much. What a lovely conversation. Thank you.